In the year 1090, on the cold plains of Burgundy, Bernard was born into a family of both nobility and faith. His father, Tescelin Lusor, a knight of high standing, was a man whose life was marked by loyalty to his overlords and reverence for the church. His mother, Olive of Montbard, was the true heart of the household. Known for her piety and wisdom, she would shape her son in ways that neither he nor the world could yet imagine. Even before Bernard could speak, Olive offered him to God, whispering prayers over his cradle, as if she knew he was destined for extraordinary things. The home in which Bernard grew was no palace, but a fortified household where discipline and devotion intertwined. Tescelin trained his sons for the life of knighthood, horsemanship, swordsmanship, and loyalty in feudal duty. But Olive filled their hearts with the rhythms of the Psalms and the fragrance of prayer. She was remembered for gathering her children at night to teach them sacred words, making the melodies of the divine office the lullabies of their youth. Bernard, even as a small boy, absorbed these lessons with unusual fervor. Unlike his brothers, who delighted in mock sword fights or riding exercises, Bernard would slip away to gaze upon the hills, losing himself in thought and murmured prayers. When he was 7, a memory etched itself into him forever. One Christmas Eve, as snow blanketed Montbard, the family crowded into the small chapel, its torches flickering against stone walls. The priest lifted his voice in the Gloria, and the child Bernard stared at the creche with wide eyes. Afterward, he turned to his mother and asked in breathless wonder if it were true that God had chosen to lie in a manger. Olive, moved to tears, answered yes, and told him that Christ wished to dwell in every humble heart that welcomed him. That night Bernard lay awake long after the others slept, whispering to the child Jesus, as if he were really present at his bedside. It was a moment that foreshadowed his lifelong conviction that God was no distant deity, but a lover seeking intimacy with the soul. Schooling followed at Chatillon-sur-Seine, where Bernard studied under canons who instructed him in Latin, rhetoric, and the liberal arts. His teachers quickly recognized a sharp mind and an almost frightening memory. He excelled in composing verse and analyzing arguments. Yet what struck them more was his interiority. While other boys took pride in their eloquence, Bernard's writings leaned toward prayer. He once composed lines comparing Mary to a spotless window through which the sun of justice streamed, a metaphor far beyond his years. It was not merely skill but longing that shaped his words. Adolescence brought its own trials. He was handsome, with fair hair, bright eyes, and a delicate frame. Women noticed him, and temptation stirred. At one feast, a noble woman teased him for his seriousness and tried to draw him into flirtation. Bernard, embarrassed and shaken, fled the hall and spent the night before a crucifix in tears, begging God to preserve him. These struggles did not harden him, but deepened his reliance on grace. He came to see purity not as pride in his own strength, but as a gift sustained by constant prayer. His mother's influence grew even stronger as he approached manhood. Olive often placed her hands upon his shoulders, looking at him with intensity, and reminded him that all earthly glory was passing. She desired that he serve God wholly. Her death came before Bernard reached his 20s, and it left him shaken. He felt as if the guiding star of his youth had been extinguished. Yet in the emptiness, her words resounded more powerfully, and he resolved to give himself completely to the Lord. The decisive turning came one winter day as Bernard walked alone near Montbard. The frozen stillness of the fields pressed upon him, and suddenly his soul was flooded with both terror and sweetness. He felt as though Christ himself had drawn near. He fell to his knees in the snow and offered himself without reserve. "Take me, Lord, entirely. Let nothing remain in me but you." That mystical encounter burned so deeply into his heart that from then on his course was set. Still, his family resisted. Tescelin expected him to become a knight, and his brother scoffed at the thought of him abandoning honor and estates for the obscurity of a monastery. But Bernard's determination did not falter. More than that, he began to persuade others. He spoke with such conviction that his words pierced like arrows. One by one his brothers yielded. His eldest brother Guy, after a long night of argument, confessed that Bernard's voice had burned his heart and surrendered to join him. Friends and cousins followed, until Bernard had gathered a small band of 30 companions, who together resolved to enter the reforming monastery of Citeaux. It was the year 1112 when Bernard, 22 years old, led this procession to the gates of Citeaux. The abbey, founded only 14 years earlier, was struggling. Its austerity was too severe for many, and novices were scarce. But when Bernard appeared with his company of brothers and friends, the monks saw it as a miracle. The fire that seemed near extinction was suddenly rekindled. Bernard had not yet preached to the world, but already his presence was renewing Christendom. Inside the monastery, Bernard threw himself into a life of prayer and labor with a zeal that alarmed even his superiors. He fasted to extremes, at times eating only boiled herbs. He worked in the fields until his frail body trembled. He prayed through the nights, kneeling on cold stone until dawn broke. Yet what most struck those around him was not his discipline, but his fervor. He seemed to live in constant awareness of God. In choir, his voice trembled with tears. In silence, his face glowed as though he conversed with the unseen. His body, however, nearly gave way. The rigors of fasting and sleeplessness left him pale, weak, and feverish. His brethren feared he would die before his vocation bore fruit. Finally, the abbot, Stephen Harding, intervened. With fatherly firmness, he commanded Bernard to eat, to sleep, and to temper his zeal with wisdom. Bernard obeyed, humbled but not crushed. He learned that holiness was not in destroying the body, but in offering it to God as a living sacrifice. This moderation preserved his health, though he would never be robust. It was at Citeaux that Bernard's mystical experiences deepened. During the chanting of the antiphons, he would sometimes fall into rapture, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Monks testified that his face seemed luminous, as though he were already half in heaven. He himself spoke little of such things, but later he would describe moment of prayer as the soul being kissed by the Word, filled with a sweetness beyond all earthly delight. During these years, he also developed a profound devotion to Mary. Tempted one night by thoughts that disturbed his purity, he fell asleep in the chapel exhausted. He dreamed that the Virgin appeared, radiant with light, and touched his forehead with motherly gentleness. He awoke in peace, and from then on never doubted her intercession. Mary became for him the star of the sea, the ladder between heaven and earth, the tender mother who guides souls safely to Christ. His sermons and hymns would later breathe this confidence into countless others. By 1115, it was clear to Abbot Stephen that Bernard's gifts could not remain hidden. Though still only 25, he was chosen to lead a new foundation. The site was a wild valley called Vallée d'Absinthe, a desolate place of thickets, wolves, and swamps. To most it seemed barren, but Bernard saw it as holy ground. With 12 monks he set out to clear the land, chop the trees, drain the marshes, and build a monastery. The Valley of Wormwood became Clairvaux, the Valley of Light. This step marked the beginning of Bernard's true mission. Though still young, sickly, and unknown to the world, he was now abbot of a community that would grow into one of the most influential monasteries in Europe. And from the silence of Clairvaux, his voice would soon reach kings, popes, and scholars, shaking the thrones of princes and stirring the hearts of common men. The wilderness that Bernard and his companions entered in 1115 was as bleak as any nightly battlefield. The Vallée d'Absinthe was swampy, dark, and infested with thickets. When Bernard first surveyed the ground that would be Clairvaux, he saw ruin, but also promise. With sleeves rolled high, he and his brothers felled trees, cleared brush, and dug trenches to drain the marshes. Their diet was bread, wild herbs, and water, their beds rough planks. Bernard himself, though already thin and weakened from his time at Citeaux, labored as fiercely as any. If he collapsed from exhaustion, he would rise again, fire in his eyes, until others begged him to rest. It was Bernard who gave the valley its new name, Clairvaux, the Valley of Light. The name seemed almost absurd at first, for the place remained harsh and gloomy, but in time it became prophetic. Light did indeed radiate from this wilderness into all of Europe. Within a few years a community grew, drawing vocations from far and wide. Young men came in such numbers that Clairvaux soon had to send out colonies of monks to establish daughter houses. By the time Bernard died, Clairvaux would be mother to more than 60 monasteries. Life at Clairvaux was severe, but filled with spirit. The monks rose before dawn to chant matins in the cold chapel, their voices echoing through the valley. Days were filled with labor, prayer, and study, with silence reigning at every hour. Bernard, though abbot, lived with no privilege. He ate little, often only boiled nettles, and wore the same coarse habit as his brethren. Yet he was not merely an administrator. He was a father who guided, corrected, and inspired. When a young novice faltered under hardships, Bernard would draw him aside, speak gently of Christ's love, and rekindle his courage. When others grew proud, he rebuked them sharply, reminding them that humility was the root of every virtue. It was in these years that Bernard's mystical life deepened. He preached often to his monks, and his sermons became treasures. He loved especially to expound on the Song of Songs. His monks would sit enraptured as he spoke of the soul's longing for Christ the bridegroom. He described divine love not as cold doctrine, but as a living embrace. At times he would fall silent, overcome by tears, and the brothers would feel that heaven itself had descended upon the cloister. These sermons, copied and carried beyond Clairvaux, became the foundation of his reputation as a spiritual master. But Bernard was not to remain hidden in the cloister. The world soon sought him. His reputation spread until bishops and princes sought his counsel, and eventually popes themselves turned to him in times of crisis. The greatest of these crises erupted in 1130 with the death of Pope Honorius II, when a contested election split Christendom in two. At that conclave in Rome, the cardinals were divided. A majority quickly elected Innocent II, a man of noble birth but modest strength. Yet a faction opposed him, backed by powerful Roman families, seized a moment and chose another, Anacletus II. At once Europe was torn apart. Some supported Innocent, others Anacletus. The Church, the very heart of Christendom, stood on the brink of schism. Innocent fled Rome, desperate and nearly powerless. Few recognized him. His authority was fragile, his claim disputed. But one man stood firmly at his side, Bernard of Clairvaux, the monk of the Valley of Light, with no army, no office beyond his abbacy, suddenly became the defender of papal legitimacy. Bernard's loyalty was not merely political. He discerned in Innocent the lawful successor, and in Anacletus the product of intrigue. He threw himself into the cause with all the passion he had once given to his monastery. His letters from this period show both fire and tenderness. To bishops wavering between obediences, he wrote with mixture of reasoning and warning, insisting that obedience to Anacletus was disobedience to Christ himself. To Innocent, he wrote words of encouragement, assuring him that though his throne was empty, heaven had not abandoned him. Then Bernard set out across Europe to win support for Innocent. He traveled ceaselessly from France into Germany and Italy, pleading with kings, arguing with bishops, stirring crowds with his sermons. He was no diplomat in the worldly sense. His power was holiness. Kings who would ignore envoys trembled before Bernard's words. When Innocent arrived in France, it was Bernard who brought him before King Louis VI and persuaded the monarch to recognize him. When the matter went before a great council at Étampes, Bernard spoke with such clarity and conviction that Innocent was acclaimed as true pope. The Cistercian abbot had done what armies could not. He had secured France for Innocent, but the battle was not over. Anacletus had strong support in Italy, backed by the mighty Pirlioni family in Rome, and even the Normans of Sicily. Bernard pressed on. In Germany, he met Emperor Lothair. The emperor hesitated. The choice was dangerous. Bernard spoke boldly, telling him that kings were judged not by prudence but by fidelity to Christ. The emperor yielded, and soon Germany, too, stood behind Innocent. Bernard then traveled into northern Italy, persuading bishops and city leaders with his unshakable fervor. Wherever he went, people felt that it was not a monk but an apostle who spoke. In 1133, Bernard accompanied Innocent himself to Rome, though the city was hostile and largely held by Anacletus. With imperial forces at his side, Innocent was enthroned briefly in St. Peter's, but it was Bernard's presence that gave him credibility. Even when Anacletus controlled Rome, Bernard ensured that Innocent was recognized throughout most of Europe. For nearly 8 years the schism dragged on. Anacletus held Rome and much of southern Italy, while Innocent commanded broader allegiance across Europe. Bernard never wavered. He continued to write letters, preach sermons, and admonish the wavering. His correspondence from this period shows extraordinary boldness. To one group of clergy he wrote, "Why do you halt between two obediences? The body of Christ is one, not divided. Will you wound him anew by your hesitation?" His words cut through the fog of politics and forced men to choose. In 1138, Anacletus died, but even then the schism might have lingered. His supporters rallied around a new candidate, a figurehead pope. Bernard intervened with all his authority. He went to the cardinals who remained opposed and persuaded them to lay down their claims. His words, stern yet infused with charity, broke their resistance. Within months the schism ended. Innocent was universally recognized, and the unity of the Church was restored. It was widely acknowledged, even by Innocent himself, that Bernard had been a decisive instrument in saving the papacy. He, a simple abbot from a remote valley, had bent kings and emperors, out-argued bishops, and defeated factions not with swords but with his burning conviction. Europe marveled, and Bernard's reputation soared. People spoke of him as the conscience of Christendom, a man in whom God's authority shone without office or crown. Yet Bernard himself remained humble. In his letters after the schism, he insisted that he had done nothing but obey. He called himself a poor monk of Clairvaux, and begged others not to praise him but to thank God. When Innocent sought to shower honors on him, Bernard refused, retreating to his monastery and immersing himself once more in the silence of prayer. But the world would not leave him in peace. His success in the schism meant that whenever Christendom faced crisis, it was Bernard to whom men turned. At Clairvaux, however, life continued with quiet regularity. The community swelled with new vocations. Bernard preached to his monks with the same passion he had shown in courts and councils. His sermons during this period reveal the depths of his inner life. In one, he spoke of the love of God as the soul's only true rest. "You will find nothing in heaven or earth more sweet than this love," he told his brothers, "for it is infinite and it alone satisfies." His words carried the weight of one who had tasted what he described. Visitors streamed to Clairvaux from all over Europe. Bishops seeking advice, nobles asking blessings, peasants begging prayers. Bernard received them all, though his body was already fragile. He healed the sick with a touch or prayer, though he never liked to speak of such things. He preferred to call men to conversion, insisting that healing the soul was greater than curing the body. By the mid-1130s, Bernard was no longer merely a monastic reformer. He was the arbiter of Christendom, the man to whom popes looked for defense, kings for counsel, and scholars for correction. The controversy with Peter Abelard which would erupt soon after, was already looming. But Bernard's reputation had been sealed by the schism. He was a man who preserved the unity of the Church when it might have shattered. The Valley of Light had cast its rays over the whole of Europe. The 1130s had established Bernard as the arbiter of Europe's conscience. Yet with influence came opposition, and nowhere did that opposition crystallize more forcefully than in his battle with Peter Abelard. Abelard was already one of the most dazzling figures of the age, a Parisian master, famed for his brilliant logic and daring intellect. Students crowded to hear him, and his charisma rivaled Bernard's own. But whereas Bernard's authority flowed from sanctity and mystical fervor, Abelard's came from the power of reason sharpened like a sword. The two men embodied different visions of theology, and their collision was inevitable. Abelard's writings probed mysteries with a boldness that shocked many. He subjected the doctrines of the Trinity and redemption to rational analysis, asking questions in a style that suggested divine mysteries could be fully grasped by syllogisms. To some, he was liberating faith from obscurantism. To Bernard, he was desecrating the holy with cold pride. Bernard believed that theology must be born from prayer, that divine mysteries were to be adored, not dissected. He trembled at the thought of young clerics learning to approach God as a problem rather than a beloved. The controversy came to a head at the Council of Sens in 1140. The King of France, Louis VII, was present, as were bishops, abbots, and scholars. Abelard was summoned to defend his writings, and Bernard stood as his chief accuser. The hall was tense. Abelard, confident in his rhetorical power, expected a triumph in debate. Bernard, frail and already weakened by illness, seemed an unlikely opponent. Yet when he rose to speak, his words carried a force that no logic could match. He did not engage Abelard point by point. Instead, Bernard spoke of the faith of the apostles, of the creed that Christians have professed since baptism, of the humility with which mysteries must be received. He warned that to reduce the Trinity to arguments was to lose sight of the living God who saves. His voice, thin but burning, carried the weight of a prophet. Those present later recalled that it felt less like an academic disputation than a sermon at the Last Judgment. Abelard faltered. Instead of countering, he grew restless, then suddenly declared he would appeal to Rome and left the council in anger. But the damage was done. The bishops condemned his teachings, and the council sided with Bernard. To some, it seemed a triumph of authority over reason, but to Bernard it was a defense of the mystery of faith against pride. Yet Bernard was no personal enemy to Abelard. After the condemnation, he sought reconciliation. When Abelard, broken in spirit, sought refuge at Cluny under Abbot Peter the Venerable, Bernard approved. Letters passed between them, and before Abelard's death, the two were reconciled. Bernard wept when he heard of his passing, saying that he desired not Abelard's humiliation, but his salvation. This, perhaps, shows the true Bernard, stern in doctrine, yet tender in soul. He could not allow theology to become arrogance, but he did not cease to love the man he opposed. This battle with Abelard revealed the heart of Bernard's spirituality. For him, knowledge was worthless unless it led to love. What use is learning, he wrote, if it does not inflame the heart? His insistence shaped monastic theology for centuries. The Cistercians, under his influence, avoided the speculative extremes of scholasticism and developed instead a theology of experience, grounded in prayer and scripture. His own sermons on the Song of Songs became the high point of this approach. It is impossible to understand Bernard apart from those sermons. Imagine him in the chapter house at Clairvaux, his monks seated before him in silence, candles flickering on stone walls. He opens a sacred text. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Then he pauses, as if savoring something beyond words. These kisses, he explained softly, are the infusions of grace. When the bridegroom stoops to the soul, they are not kisses of the lips, but of the heart, and they leave a sweetness that no earthly delight can imitate. The monks listen, moved to tears. They do not hear a lecture, but a love song, an invitation to intimacy with Christ. Bernard speaks not from speculation, but from experience. He has known these touches of grace in his own prayer, and so he can describe them with the vividness of one who has tasted them. His mysticism was not escape from the world, but the very source of his power in it. Because he had encountered Christ as bridegroom, he could speak with such fire that kings trembled and scholars bent. He was unafraid of emperors because he knew himself already embraced by a greater king. His words in councils and courts carry conviction not because of logic, but because they were breathed out of prayer. Even as he defended the faith against Abelard, Bernard remained deeply engaged in the affairs of the wider church. His letters reveal a man who advised popes, rebuked bishops, encouraged novices, and consoled widows. He could be gentle or sharp, depending on the soul before him. To one abbot growing lax, he wrote with severity, "You are fattening the body while starving the soul. Awake, before the bridegroom comes and finds you asleep." To another, grieving over a brother's death, he wrote with tenderness, "Do not say he is lost. Say rather that he has gone ahead, and we follow after." His pen was tireless, and through it he guided Christendom as surely as through his voice. Yet even his voice would be called upon for a mission greater than any before. In 1145, his former disciple, Bernard's own spiritual son, was elected Pope Eugenius III. This Cistercian, once a monk under Bernard's direction, now bore the weight of the papacy. Overwhelmed, he turned to his old master for guidance. Bernard responded with the Book of Considerations, a treatise written directly to the Pope himself. In it, Bernard laid out what it meant to govern the Church. Not ambition, not wealth, not worldly policy, but contemplation of God. Consider yourself. Consider what you are. Consider whose you are, he urged Eugenius. You are the shepherd of souls, not the ruler of kingdoms. No other abbot in history had dared write so candidly to a pope. Eugenius received it not as rebuke, but as fatherly counsel. But Eugenius soon faced a crisis that would demand more than books. In 1144, the Christian city of Edessa in the east had fallen to Muslim forces. Panic spread across Europe, for this was the first great loss since the triumph of the First Crusade. The Holy Land seemed in peril, and pilgrims were slaughtered. Eugenius, desperate to rally Christendom, turned to Bernard. Only he could summon the fervor needed. Bernard hesitated. He was no soldier, no politician. He longed for silence, not battle cries. But obedience compelled him. Eugenius commanded him to preach the crusade, and Bernard bowed to God's will. In March 1146 he appeared at Vézelay, where an immense crowd gathered. Peasants, knights, bishops, and the King of France himself, Louis VII, with Queen Eleanor at his side. A wooden platform had been erected, but the multitude overflowed the fields. Bernard, pale and gaunt in his simple habit, mounted it. When he raised his hand, the crowd fell silent. He spoke not of glory or conquest, but of Christ crucified. The land where he walked bleeds, he cried. The sepulchre where he rose is defiled. Will you leave it abandoned? His words were fire. Louis VII rose and knelt, receiving the cross from Bernard's hands. The Queen followed, and then nobles surged forward. When the supply of crosses ran out, Bernard tore his own habit into strips to fashion more. The crowd wept, shouted, and pledged themselves. It seemed as though heaven itself had spoken to the abbot of Clairvaux. From France, Bernard traveled into Germany. At first, Emperor Conrad III resisted, wary of another costly campaign. But at Speyer, Bernard preached before thousands. His voice rang with such conviction that the emperor himself knelt and took the cross. Again the crowd surged, peasants and nobles alike enlisting. The movement swept across Europe with astonishing speed. carried not by force of arms, but by the frail monk's words. Yet though the Second Crusade began with fire, it ended in ashes. The armies failed through poor leadership and disunity. Edessa was not retaken, and the campaign collapsed in humiliation. When the news returned, murmurs of blame rose against Bernard. Many said he had deceived them with false promises. For Bernard, it was a bitter cross. He had poured out his soul, and the result was disaster. He wrote in anguish, "Who will deliver me from shame?" I spoke, and they went, "I promise," and they fell. The judgments of God are deep. But he did not abandon faith. He confessed his pain openly, but insisted that the failure was not God's betrayal, but the fruit of human sin. The Crusaders, he argued, had been defeated by their pride and disobedience. The Lord was testing his people, he wrote, and they were found wanting. Though the world mocked, his humility preserved his authority. Those who had expected excuses found instead a man crushed yet still faithful. In this paradox, victory and humiliation, Bernard's greatness shone. He did not cling to success as proof of his mission. He embraced failure as a cross, uniting his shame to Christ's. It was this ability to turn even disaster into witness that made men continue to seek him as their guide. After the bitter collapse of the Second Crusade, Bernard's fame remained but was tempered by sorrow. The monk who had once been hailed as a prophet now lived under the shadow of accusations. Many whispered that his words had promised victory and delivered only defeat. Bernard, never one to shield himself from blame, accepted the shame. "They asked me to explain God's judgments," he confessed in a letter, "but I cannot. I only know that he is just, even when his ways confound us." For a man who had carried kings and emperors with his voice, it was an act of extraordinary humility to stand before the world and admit defeat. The controversies of Bernard's later years also included his defense of orthodoxy against new heresies. In southern France, the Cathars, or Albigensians, were spreading their dualistic creed, rejecting the sacraments and scorning the material world as evil. Bernard, though exhausted, traveled there to preach. His sermons were simple, burning with the same mystical love that had drawn thousands before. Crowds listened in awe, but Bernard soon realized that words alone could not uproot error. The movement would not be crushed in his lifetime, yet his presence sowed seeds of truth, and he returned to Clairvaux trusting that the Lord would one day bring light where darkness remained. It was also in these years that Bernard turned his pen towards some of his most enduring treatises. His On Loving God remains a classic of Christian spirituality, written with clarity and warmth. It asks why and how one should love God. His answer was disarmingly simple. God must be loved because he first loved us, and that love must have no measure. The measure of loving God, he wrote, is to love without measure. He traced the soul's progress through stages of love, beginning with self-love and rising to love of God for his own sake. It was not abstract, but experiential, drawn from Bernard's own life of prayer. The treatise spread quickly, copied by monks and laymen alike, shaping the spirituality of Europe. His writings on humility were equally influential. And on humility and pride, Bernard described humility as the foundation of all virtues. The greater you are, he warned, the more you must humble yourself, lest pride steal your crown. He often illustrated humility with vivid images, a ladder descending into truth, the soul stripped of illusions, a beggar with empty hands before God. For Bernard, humility was not weakness but freedom, the only posture in which the soul could receive divine love. His words struck home precisely because they were embodied in his own life. Even as he advised popes and corrected kings, he continued to call himself a poor sinner. Bernard's mystical life in these final years deepened even as his body grew frail. He was often ill, plagued by digestive pains and fevers, the result of decades of fasting and labor. Yet when he prayed, witnesses saw him transfigured. During Mass, he sometimes fell into ecstasy, his face shining, his eyes fixed on unseen realities. On Christmas Eve one year, while chanting the Gospel of the Nativity, he suddenly cried out with such joy that the whole choir fell silent, convinced he had seen the infant Christ before him. At other times, meditating on the Passion, he would collapse in tears, as though pierced by the nails himself. These experiences infused his preaching with authenticity. He spoke not of ideas, but of encounters. Despite his frailty, Bernard continued to receive visitors from across Europe. Kings and bishops came for counsel, peasants for blessing. His cell at Clairvaux became a kind of court of wisdom, though far humbler than any royal hall. Many came seeking miracles, and indeed healings continued. A boy crippled from birth was brought, and at Bernard's blessing he stood and walked. A woman tormented by demons shrieked until Bernard commanded silence in the name of Christ, and peace fell upon her. Yet Bernard himself always downplayed these wonders. The true miracle, he insisted, is the sinner who turns back to God. The memory of his great controversy with Abelard never left him. Some accuse him of crushing intellectual freedom, of being the enemy of reason. But Bernard always insisted he loved reason when it served faith, and only opposed it when it usurped love. In a letter written late in life, he reflected on the matter. I fought Abelard not as a man, but as an error, and when he was reconciled to the Church, I rejoiced more in his peace than in any victory. He carried no personal malice, and his reconciliation with Abelard's memory showed his charity. His influence on the papacy continued almost until his death. When disputes arose among cardinals or tensions flared with rulers, Bernard's voice was sought. Even in his final years, he wrote to the Pope with boldness, warning against excess and urging reform. To some it seemed unthinkable that a monk from a valley in Burgundy could wield such influence. Yet all recognized that his authority did not come from wealth or power, but from holiness. By the early 1150s, Bernard's health was failing rapidly. He was thin as parchment, his face lined with suffering, his body bent. Yet his spirit remained aflame. His monks often found him lost in prayer, his lips moving silently. At times he would sit motionless for hours, as if already gazing upon God. When asked what occupied him, he replied simply, I am waiting for my Lord. The death of loved ones added to his sorrow. Many of his brothers in blood, who had followed him into monastic life, preceded him into eternity. The death of his brother Gerard, his closest companion, was a particular wound. Bernard wept openly at his funeral, confessing that half of himself was buried with his brother. Yet even in grief he turned the loss into teaching, reminding his monks that every earthly parting was a summons to deeper longing for the eternal reunion in Christ. In the summer of 1153, Bernard's condition worsened. Fever consumed him, and he could no longer rise from his bed. His monks gathered in silence around their beloved abbot. They chanted the psalms he had taught them, their voices trembling with grief. Bernard listened, sometimes joining faintly. At his request, the Song of Songs was read once more, the book that had been the wellspring of his mysticism. As the words, "Draw me after you, let us run," were spoken, his eyes filled with light, and a faint smile crossed his lips. On August 20th, 1153, Bernard gave his final blessing to his community. He raised his thin hand, tracing the cross in the air. With a whisper, he urged them to remain in love and humility, to cling to Christ above all. Then, surrounded by the chant of his monks, he closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, and in peace he surrendered his soul to the bridegroom he had loved so passionately. News of his death spread quickly across Europe. Kings, bishops, peasants, and monks alike mourned. For some it was as if a father had died. For others, a prophet. Yet his monks at Clairvaux knew best that his passing was not an end but a consummation. He had lived his life as a lover of God, and now he had entered the embrace he had so long desired. In time, The church canonized him, and later declared him a doctor of the church. But titles meant little compared to the living memory of the man himself. The abbot who preached as though fire lived his chest, who reconciled popes and emperors, who battled scholars and heretics, who healed the sick and comforted the broken, who in every letter called himself simply Bernard, sinner. His legacy was not merely in politics or theology, but in the mystical fire that burned at Clairvaux, a fire that still illuminates hearts centuries later.